One of the reasons why an arguably free society needs places like Washington University is that universities provide the time and the sort of environment in which uncertainty can flourish. And happily, for a week or two after the Edward Snowden story broke late last May, a great many Americans seemed to find themselves in the democratically salutary condition of being university-minded. The phrase I most often heard repeated in those weeks, on campus and off, was, "I don't know what I think." It wasn't for want of thinking, of course, but the revelation that Snowden had leaked some 200,000 or so classified documents exposing a sprawling system of domestic surveillance of unexpected extent put us in the fine condition of worried curiosity and alerted, impassioned, but cautious, suspended judgment. To our great civil good fortune, the entire nation was rendered temporarily academic. Still in this useful perplexity, I was in Dean Schall's office, and we were talking about the humanities, and she was speaking of the importance of the humane crafts of ethics and of persuasion, the way the humanities help us know what to do and help us persuade others what to do and what to stop doing. This was a little too abstract and a little too instrumental for me, and I wanted the conversation enlarged, so I reminded her of the engagement of the humanities with almost everything that rouses and perplexes. I'd been reading the paper in her waiting room, and I said to her, "Take privacy. It has a dense, messy, conceptual and institutional structure. It has a history. It is a great good and a great danger. The university has a responsibility to worry over privacy, and the humanities own privacy." Like a good dean, she followed up with an email, and I in turn emailed 5 brilliant colleagues, 6. Being careful to include a social scientist and a couple of law professors, all very humanities friendly. And here we are, a public forum on privacy and surveillance sponsored by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences with help from the Interdisciplinary Project in the Humanities, of which I'm the current director. We'll have remarks from 2 speakers, take a few questions, 3 more speakers, and then we'll throw the floor open. Our first 2 speakers are Frank Lovett and Neil Richards. Frank Lovett is a professor of political science and director of the Legal Studies program, a specialist in the work of John Rawls and in theories of social justice in general. Neil Richards is a professor of law, internationally recognized for his expertise in First Amendment law and on the regulation of information. His book on intellectual privacy is due out from Oxford University Press next year. I should mention that we have a second law professor on the panel as a source of kibitzing wisdom and attention, Liz Sepper, who specializes in conflicts over medical conscience legislation and in general matters of the relation between law, ethics, and medicine. My pages are stuck together. She's offered to help out if we need help during the question period. So first, Professor Lovett.
All right. Thanks, Joe, for the kind introduction. And thanks also for organizing this event and putting together such a panel of such distinguished experts, which leads me to my first question, namely, what am I doing here? Unlike many of the other panelists here, I should say up front that privacy has not been, for me, a central area of scholarly research, or indeed, really, until I started thinking about it for this event, an area of particular personal concern on my part. But I do know a few things, at any rate, about Western intellectual history. And so perhaps I thought that I could contribute something to our discussion today with respect to the history of the idea of privacy. At any rate, that's what I'm going to try to do. In doing so, however, that leads me to my second question. In exploring the history of the idea of privacy, almost immediately we encounter a significant obstacle. So in order to trace the history of any idea, whether it's freedom or democracy or equality or whatever, one must presumably first have some rough idea, at least, of what the concept refers to. And unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, as one discovers pretty quickly on reading the relevant literature, just about the only thing, it seems to me, that contemporary scholars of privacy agree on is that they don't agree what the meaning of privacy is. But we shouldn't let that stop us. It's no excuse for avoiding an issue of such evident concern to so many people. And so provisionally, what I'm going to do is at least start by turning to what's sometimes described as the most prominent definition presently in circulation. I'm sure others may correct me on that, namely the definition provided by Allman. So Allman says that privacy is the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. Now, in reflection, this definition just can't serve as it stands, for, at least it seems to me, it's not a definition of privacy at all, but rather a definition of the right of privacy. The claim of individuals is a right to something. But I do think we can extrapolate from it a little bit what we might say the idea of privacy underlying Weston's definition is. And doing that, we would get something like this. Privacy is the freedom privacy is freedom from the observation or attention of others, full stop. And then we could add, if we want, that a right to privacy, in turn, is the right to decide how much freedom from observation one wants or prefers to enjoy. But that's not quite right either. Defining privacy as a sort of freedom, I think, unavoidably connotes at least some degree of value. And my interest today is precisely when and why privacy came to be regarded as having value. Indeed, my thesis will be that privacy came to be regarded as something valuable specifically to individuals, and thereby as something worth protecting as an individual moral and legal right, only through the constellation of a particular set of historical circumstances. Indeed, one of the most striking facts about the individual right of privacy is its relative newness. So far as I can tell, there is virtually no interest in privacy rights prior to, let's say, the late 19th century. To fully appreciate this novelty, however, we must carefully distinguish privacy from two closely related but importantly distinct ideas with which it is sometimes confused. So the first is the very old and distinguished idea of withdrawal from an active life of public engagement. Stemming from a famous discussion in Aristotle, it was long a popular topic of philosophical debate, which was better, the life of contemplation or the life of action, as it was usually put. Other times, these two were denoted the private life and the public life, respectively. The Epicureans famously argued that the best life was a contemplative one, shared with a few close friends in a secluded garden, free from the worldly cares of politics or business. Remarkably, there arose in the diametrically opposed Christian tradition a similar valorization of the secluded hermit and later of the withdrawn monastic life. In such efforts to withdraw from society, however, privacy, in the relevant sense, is not strictly the aim. Indeed, life in a monastery is very nearly the opposite of private. Rather, the aim is to free oneself from worldly cares and burdens for the specific purpose of achieving unencumbered philosophical or spiritual enlightenment. And the degree to which others happen to observe one's contemplative efforts or not is simply besides the point. Another idea often confused with privacy is the idea of what political theorists nowadays call negative liberty. Roughly speaking, an individual's freedom from external interference to make his or her own choices. Now, the domain of choice over which individuals enjoy this freedom is sometimes called the private sphere. And contrary to a view made popular by Benjamin Constant, the ancients were perfectly cognizant of negative liberty and the private sphere, though of course not always under those names, and we're even prepared to recognize that the existence of some sphere of individual choice had real, albeit limited, value. This private sphere, however, is again not equivalent to the idea of privacy with which we are concerned today. This can easily be seen when we observe that one can enjoy negative liberty even in the absence of privacy, and that one might desire privacy even in the absence of negative liberty. So as an example of the former, consider that one enjoys considerable freedom of choice at the grocery store, even though one's shopping is conducted entirely in public. And as an example of the latter, consider that although no one has any choice over his or her own genes, one might nevertheless want personal genetic information kept private. Therefore, let us say that privacy, in the sense relevant for our discussion today, is simply the state of being unobserved or unattended to by others. Interestingly, the idea of privacy, so defined, is not at all new. What is new is only the idea that privacy, so defined, has important value for individuals specifically, and thus is worth protecting as an individual moral or legal right. Contrary to this modern view, privacy was originally seen as something valuable primarily to society, not to individuals. For whatever reason, and it's far beyond my scholarly competence to venture any sort of explanation, all human cultures seem to have developed the notion that certain sorts of activities or states of being ought normally to be hidden from public view. Which activities or which states of being in particular ought to be so hidden have varied. But to list a few obvious and common examples, copulation, defecation, and menstruation. Some trace of this notion persists today, of course, and is reflected, for example, in public decency laws. The cultural articulation of this demand might be aesthetic, hygienic, spiritual, or some combination of these, but regardless, the keeping of such things, or certain things, private was principally regarded as something important to the community, and not the individual in question, except perhaps derivatively. Whether indeed the community has such a legitimate interest in privacy can and has been debated. The cynics of ancient Greece, for example, notoriously challenged such claims by masturbating in public. But the modern idea of an individual right to privacy is obviously quite different from this. The state of being unobserved or unattended to by others is now seen as something potentially valuable to the individual, him or herself. Now, how did this remarkable transformation come about? It seems to me that three factors may have been independently necessary to create a demand for individual privacy rights roughly around the end of the 19th century. First, it was necessary that there arise an awareness of the potentially constraining force of public opinion as such. That one can be constrained by the coercive apparatus of the state is, of course, plainly obvious. That one can be motivated to extraordinary acts by the prospect of public approbation and discouraged by public disapprobation has long been recognized. But the normalizing force of public opinion is something a little bit more subtle, and to grasp it requires thinking like a sociologist. It's not clear to me how or when the normalizing force of public opinion became fully apparent to thoughtful people, but in the 18th century, David Hume used it to explain descriptive patterns in moral belief. Thus, I think we can say that the idea was at least in circulation from the Enlightenment period onward. Second, there needs to be some sense that the normalizing force of public opinion is not necessarily a good thing. And this would have been very difficult for people to accept until comparatively recently. From ancient times, it was a deep foundational assumption that social order absolutely depends on the existence of a shared conception of the good. Of course, people might disagree about a great many lesser things, it was thought, but surely we must agree on the most important questions of morality and religion and so forth if we're to live together in peace and community. And it was precisely this assumption, often as not unarticulated, that made the conflicts of the Reformation era so deadly serious. Only after a century and a half of inconclusive religious warfare did people come to accept, grudgingly at first, the need to live with irreducible disagreement. And even so, it was a long journey of several generations from putting up with difference because the alternative conflict is worse, on the one hand, to a positive valorization of individuality and diversity on the other. That we might actually benefit, both individually and collectively, from experiments in living was not fully appreciated until the time of John Stuart Mill. Third, having recognized the value of individuality and the potential danger posed to that individuality by the normalizing force of public opinion, we are most of the way to an individual right of privacy. Most, but not all. To see this, imagine that we lived in a very tolerant society, one in which people did not particularly care about, or maybe even enjoyed, the sheer diversity of human life. In such a society, while public opinion might have the potential to exercise its usual normalizing force, it would not do so, in fact. The importance of privacy, it seems to me, would be much diminished in such a society, for there is little need, it seems to me, to hide from an indifferent gaze. Now, this sort of tolerance was decidedly not characteristic of late 19th century Western society, and thus it is no surprise, given first a previous recognition of individuality as a positive good, together with second an understanding of the force of public opinion, that third, the demand for individual rights of privacy should arise precisely when that power was exercised most energetically. So, final thought. Do we need privacy as much as we once did? My story ends around the time that Warren and Brandeis first proposed an explicit legal right to privacy in their famous article of 1890. And this is about when, I expect at any rate, although I haven't seen their presentations, when many of the other panelists might begin their stories. So it's worth reflecting whether our society needs more privacy, or rather, whether we need a more tolerant society, a more equal society, or a more fair society. Perhaps the other speakers today can help us answer these questions, and certainly I look forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you.
So thank you, Frank and Joe, for organizing what I'm hoping will be what I'm sure will be a fascinating couple of hours. So I wanted to disagree with something that Joe said when he said, even though I was once a humanist, that privacy belongs to the humanities. Privacy might, this panel might belong to the humanities, though the law school is hosting the room. If the humanities allow us to understand privacy, it is law with which we implement in the first order privacy in our society. Social norms, of course, play a tremendous role as well. I want to talk not about privacy in general, or even about, though I've talked about it a lot in the past, Warren and Brandeis, I want to talk about surveillance. Surveillance is one of those concepts that we have been thinking a lot about since the first week in May. This, of course, is Hauptmann Gerd Wiesler from the film The Lives of Others, played by Ulrich Mühe, the famous German actor. The movie, if you've not seen it, please go see it, depicts a act of surveillance of political and social dissidents in East Germany under the Stasi, or by the Stasi, and it is in large part viewed from the perspective of the surveiller, of the watcher, in this case, Hauptmann Wiesler. Our society, our culture, is full of depictions of surveillance and warnings of surveillance, right? We have 1984, we have The Lives of Others, we have Minority Report, we have CCTV cameras and red light cameras. I saw the university installing some on Forsyth just a couple of weeks ago. We also have laws that deal with surveillance, some of which apparently get disregarded when the government finds them inconvenient. But we don't really have an account of why surveillance is bad, right? Why the Snowden revelations are things that we should care about. After all, if we have nothing to hide, the NSA is not going to be interested in what we are doing. In order to do that, I think we need a definition of surveillance. My definition here is adopted from the Canadian sociologist David Lyon, who I believe teaches at Ottawa, and it has 4 elements. First of all, surveillance is focused on individuals. It's interested in what people are doing. Second, surveillance is intentional. It is not random. It is intentionally focused on finding out information about people. Third, surveillance is routine. It is part of the ordinary apparatus of modern bureaucracies. That famous cinematic image of surveillance, the Eye of Sauron, from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, is not surveillance under this definition, except maybe the tower. It is a tower on which the eye is placed. If the tower has a bureaucracy of orcs underneath the eye, which are recording details, for, passing on to the Dark Riders and all that stuff, then it would be, right? The surveillance is ordinary. It is systematic. It is the surveillance camera right outside the Duck on Forsyth on the pole that has procedures, that presumably, hopefully has retention procedures and rules for dealing with it. It is there on purpose. The university, there are a lot of surveillance cameras here. I think the university has a purpose, an intent in placing them up. And they're focused on individuals. They're not focused on watching the trees on Olympian Way grow or watching the condition of Francis Field. They're focused on you and me. Finally, surveillance can have multiple purposes. But typically, those purposes have to do with observation and typically control, right? You watch what's going on. The university watches, the police watch, the NSA watch, so that they can control, so they can interdict and stop bad things from happening, or in the case of the Boston Marathon, CCTV surveillance, they can investigate bad things that have already happened. Okay, so we are living in the age of surveillance. This, of course, is Muammar Gaddafi, the late Muammar Gaddafi. Not the late great Muammar Gaddafi, but certainly late. The Wired magazine ran a feature which showed that the Libyan government, in a room smaller than this one, with quite a few servers and some technology sold to them by Western companies, was able to surveil dissident behavior in the lead up to the revolution. It didn't stop them, the dissidents from taking effect, but there was evidence that all of the sort of Arab Spring revolutions and the Syrian crisis, all of the autocratic regimes have engaged in surveillance. Rebecca McKinnon, the CNN journalist, in her book, The Consent of the Network, documents the Chinese government's many efforts to surveil and watch dissidents and other activities through internet and electronic surveillance. But surveillance is not just for autocrats. Surveillance is for democratic regimes too. This beautiful Utah sunset is somewhat blighted by the large surveillance complex that the NSA is building at the base of that beautiful mountain. This is one of 2 facilities the NSA is building in the Utah desert to presumably capture and decrypt all communications on the internet. The supposition was they were building a large decryption computer to crack sort of high-bit encryption. And these revelations came out before we learned they were scooping up everything else, and they were also putting backdoors on most of, at least the US-generated encryption protocols. Then, of course, this guy made some news this summer. Snowden, whatever one thinks about Snowden's motives, and I think we could possibly have a 2-hour discussion just on those alone, I think that Snowden, regardless of his motives, has provided us with a valuable public service. We know better now what the Western governments of the world are doing ostensibly in our name to keep us safe, and it prompted a tremendous discussion about civil liberties, surveillance, and privacy. But I think it also shows the scope to which surveillance is a democratic society phenomenon, right? We live in the age of surveillance, but surveillance is not just for governments. Surveillance is for corporations too. What we are seeing is an overlap, a symbiosis between corporate surveillance and government surveillance. I didn't make this logo up. This is Disney's, it's the Death Star. This is Disney's logo to show its capture of the Star Wars franchise from LucasArts and Lucas Entertainment. Disney is one of the leaders in private sector surveillance. They have advanced facial recognition technologies to control both the movement of people through their parks and to encourage those people by using big data and setting things up in certain ways to spend as much money as possible. I was actually at Universal Studios in Florida last Tuesday. My brother works in the park. And I was amazed the level of fingerprinting and surveillance and management that was going on in apparently the happiest place on earth, or the one next door. At the same time, in the age of surveillance, we have limited legal protections, right? A refrain we kept hearing last summer from the NSA and from the government, well, the government hasn't broken the law. That may or may not be the case. Assuming that it is the case, though, that might just mean that the legal protections are insufficient, right? Just because something is legal, just because a law has not been broken, doesn't mean that it is ethical, doesn't mean it is conducive to civil society or to the exercise of basic civil liberties. Okay, so what we need then is an account why surveillance is bad. And my account has two parts. The first part has to do with this idea of intellectual privacy, which as Joe mentioned, I'm publishing a book on in September. The intellectual privacy has a normative claim and an empirical claim. The normative claim, if you don't agree with me on this, you could just sort of close your ears for the next 3 or 4 minutes. But it's basically the idea that intellectual privacy is important. Intellectual privacy is the protection from surveillance or interference when we're engaged in the processes of generating ideas, thinking, reading, and speaking with confidence. It is important in a free society for us to have dissident beliefs, individuality, weirdness, eccentricity, and without intellectual privacy, without some guarantee that we are not being watched, we are not being observed, people will not think ill of us, we become chilled to the mainstream. This brings up the empirical claim that surveillance, that if you buy that intellectual privacy is important, that surveillance somehow menaces or chills that. We have a series of cultural explanations for this claim. And I love showing this slide on a large screen because I get a delight from looking at your faces every time that I show it, because almost every one of you repulsed immediately when you saw this guy with his almost Hitlerian mustache. We know from the work of Bentham and Foucault and of course Orwell that surveillance does chill our behavior. There's some empirical studies. The business school actually had a study that surveillance of workers in Applebee's reduced theft, that when they knew somebody was watching, it made them behave. Of course, there's no such thing as a bad idea when there is perhaps a bad behavior like theft. This is another study from the University of Newcastle. They surveilled the faculty of the law school at Newcastle and their use of the honesty box for the daily cup of tea. And so what that is, they had a sign that says, please give generously to the honesty box, 25p or whatever it was. And the background of the sign alternated between flowers and eyes. And if you see, on the flower weeks, people gave money to and then they measured how much milk was used and figured it out. People did give, but when they put the eyes in the background, a lot more money was given. In particular, this scary vampire guy here, and more so, this guy at the bottom, who I believe, I do need to find this out 100%, I believe this is Pierluigi Collina, the great, famously alopecia-suffering football referee, who who sent off Zinedine Zidane for the headbutt a few years ago. And of course, if it is old Mr. Collina, he had the highest level of compliance, showing that he was in fact a skilled referee. There is a third explanation. So the basic point is when we're watched, we act differently. We act the way that is normal, the way that the person who is watching wants us to behave if they have power over us. And third, if we care about civil liberties as a matter of law, in free speech we don't require rigorous empirical proof before we protect against a risk of censorship or a risk of self-censorship imposed by liability. Okay, second, I'll be more brief on this one. The second danger of surveillance is it changes the power relationship between the watcher and the watched. If I know something about you that is bad, I can blackmail you. This is what the FBI did to Martin Luther King. They found out that in addition to being a dissident, they thought perhaps he was working for the communists. They found that by surveilling him that he wasn't working for the communists. He actually did believe in destabilizing the status quo for its own intrinsic and instrumental value, i.e. liberty and freedom and civil rights, but they found out that he was cheating on his wife. And they sent him a package of photographs in one of the FBI's most disreputable incidents, suggesting he should kill himself and save everybody the trouble. In a less sinister way, surveillance can also be used to coerce or to persuade. Let's say I'm the government or a corporation, and I want to manipulate you. And we're playing a game, right? If I know what your move is, if I know what your incentives are, if I know how much money you're willing to actually pay to come to Washington University, I can peg that price, I can create that incentive, I can manipulate you by knowing information about you through the power effects of surveillance without you knowing in some cases. In fact, that's when it's the most effective. And there's some evidence that internet advertisers are doing exactly this with their detailed profiles of your online surfing habits. Finally, surveillance can be used to sort, to separate one group of people from another for giving government benefit, for criminal enforcement, for fast lines at airports. The social scientists might call this sorting. Lawyers have another word for it, which is discrimination. Certain instances of surveillance-based sorting may run afoul of important civil rights guarantees, such as discrimination on the basis of race or gender or wealth or other things that we think disability might be suspect. Okay, but let me conclude by suggesting 4 principles that I think should govern how we think about surveillance. First of all, surveillance transcends the public-private divide. Even if you're only afraid of the government, if you love corporate America, in order to deal with the government portion of the problem, we have to think about corporate actors. Corporate technologies are being sold to the government is selling its technologies to corporations, data is traveling in both directions. Any solution, any understanding of the problem of surveillance, but any solution to the problem in particular, has to take account of both private and public surveillance from our age of surveillance. Second, a normative argument. Secret surveillance, particularly by the government, is illegitimate. If the government is watching you, you have a right to know. Now, in an individual case, I think you can make the case that the government shouldn't have to say, "Dear terrorist suspect, we're listening to your phone calls. Just wanted to let you know, do what you were doing as you were, but we're just, we might do so, we're just interested." They don't have to do that. But certainly the basic contours of surveillance regimes must be made public, especially if they are government surveillance, because of notions of democratic legitimacy. The people have a right to know in a free society what the government is doing in their names, in its broad contours, or perhaps we cannot say that we live in a free society any longer. Third, total surveillance is illegitimate. It is not a justification to say, well, we're interested in everything, so we'll just get everything. It seems what the NSA is doing, and it is a development in criminal law or law enforcement that is unprecedented. The scope and scale of the surveillance that is happening now was unthinkable when all of our basic principles, even our modern versions of principles of freedom and self-government, were generated. Because it was unthinkable that a democratic society would want to do this, and it was also technically impossible. Both of those constraints have been removed. And I think normatively our system is premised upon the idea, it's a good idea, that if the government is interested in a particular suspect, it must prove identifiable suspicion, reasonable, whatever the standard is, but something less than, we're just going to scoop up everything and sift it at our leisure, and then we will tell you what we find out. That raises the specter of many of the harms of surveillance, and not just the somewhat amusing to some people ones that NSA analysts look up prospective love interests using their vast surveillance powers. Finally, I think we have to understand that surveillance is harmful. Surveillance is harmful at two levels. It is harmful at the conceptual level. We should recognize this, that surveillance menaces intellectual privacy, and it warps and affects, for the worse, the power relationship between the watchers and the watched. At the practical level, I think, as we have seen in some Supreme Court cases recently, lawyers need to, including the Justice of the Supreme Court, need to recognize that surveillance of one's life is a harm, and is one that should be legally challenged in court. The problem with the challenges to the surveillance program have been having is the challengers have argued, well, we think we're being watched. They won't tell us, and the courts say, well, the government doesn't have to tell you you're being watched, even though they have to tell us. We know, but we're not going to tell you. And because you don't know, because we're not telling you, you can't prove that you're being watched. I think in order to bring this shadowy regime under the rule of law, we need to make a small doctrinal change and recognize surveillance as a harm in something lawyers call standing doctrine. And thank you. Oh, final point. If you like the idea of this article, it can be, oh, could you put there we go. It was published in the Harvard Law Review in the spring as The Dangers of Surveillance. It predates Snowden, and the book comes out in September.
The first of the next bunch is Linda Nicholson, who is Susan and William Stirratt's Professor of Women's Studies and Professor of History. She's the author of a number of books on social theory in the age of the family, on identity before identity politics, and on the nature of postmodern reason. Bill Maxwell is a colleague in the English department and also in African and African American studies, a specialist in race and American modernism, and the author of a just completed book on the African American left under J. Edgar Hoover's attentive eye. Finally, Jean Allman will speak. She chairs the history department, although she also has appointments in women, gender, and sexuality studies and in AFAS. She's the Jack Hexter Professor of History. She works on national identity, gender and colonialism, and the modernity and mobility of indigenous belief systems. So we'll start with Linda.
Excuse me. I'm going to take us back to privacy. A little bit of surveillance, but mostly privacy. I'm in the very early stages of a book on changes in the meaning of privacy in the United States over the last century. And I'm looking at privacy not as a legal, but as a cultural issue, as what some people feel entitled to keep from the eyes or ears of others. Now, a good deal of the current discussion of privacy is about its growing loss as internet companies such as Google, Amazon, and Facebook collect enormous amounts of personal data about us and as we give it up. But while my book will address these very contemporary issues, I also want to go back to changes in privacy that occurred even before the internet. I believe that this technology, like so many other technologies, while very transformative, has been so transformative in part because the stage had already been set for it to be so. And two of the themes that I will be focusing in the book are, one, changes in the value that many of us give to privacy, and also changes in the lines where privacy is drawn. Now, in relation to the first theme, I will claim that even before the internet, privacy had begun to lose a lot of its value. And in relation to the second theme, I will also show that before the internet, privacy had shifted its boundaries from what was seen as largely the province of the family to that which possessed more fluid or plastic boundaries, as existing wherever an individual chose to situate such boundaries. Both of these changes, I believe, were necessary for sites such as Facebook or Twitter to flourish when it became technologically possible for them to exist at all. Now, I'd like to begin the story with reference to an important essay written many years ago by the then married couple, Barbara and John Ehrenreich. The Ehrenreichs wrote an essay which described the emergence in the first few decades of the 20th century of what they argued was a new social class, which they called the professional managerial class. Now, they claimed that what was distinctive about this class is that it represents a type of workforce that sells not its physical labor, but its personal characteristics, its intelligence, its degree of education, its ability to get along with others, its creativity, etc. I would add that because of the nature of the labor it sells, members of this class must engage in a new kind of entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurial marketing and selling of the self. Thus, like any small business, the entrepreneurial self must market its wares, make them public. The market success of members of this class depends in part upon successful advertising. Now, the Ehrenreichs pointed to the early decades of the 20th century as a period when this class first emerged. However, it seems that it was not until after World War II when this new class truly grew in size. This is certainly true of one example of this new kind of workforce, my own profession, our own profession, academia. Now, academia is an excellent example of this new social class, for as we professors anyway know, our marketability is very much related to our reputations. That is, the degrees to which others within our fields know about and prize our contributions. But what is true of us is also true for many other members of the professional managerial class. As with academics, the success of doctors, lawyers, investment strategists, business managers, journalists, consultants of various kinds, et cetera, is dependent upon others knowing about and prizing their particular talents. Now, one consequence of this correlation of economic success and fame is that we live in what has been called by many a celebrity culture. But relevant to the issue of privacy is that an increase in the desirability of publicity must mean, at least to some extent, a decrease in the value of privacy. If our economic value is heavily dependent upon how well known we are or our celebrity status, then becoming well known may at least sometimes trump privacy's value. And also relevant to the issue of privacy is that in this economic game, the business is not primarily a family business. Rather, we are the sole negotiators of our own economic lives and of the privacy boundaries we wish to attach to those lives. To be sure, one could argue that over the past 50 years or so, while many have come to seek celebrity status, many have still worked hard to keep aspects of their lives, particularly their intimate lives, private. But I believe that over the last 50 years or so, privacy about our intimate lives has also become more easily trumped by other considerations. Moreover, as with our economic lives, privacy about our intimate lives has also become less associated with the family per se, and more understood as a fluid space that is individually negotiated. To understand these latter shifts in the value and borders of privacy, I'd like to point to changing attitudes among members of the post-World War II generation, the baby boomers, towards adult social roles, towards accepting the patterns of behavior that they viewed as governing their parents' intimate lives. Whereas love and marriage had earlier been viewed as more following certain pre-given scripts with distinctive roles for women and men, and that promised mostly happy endings for all, love and marriage had come to be seen by many members of this new generation as more precarious projects, poorly served by previous understandings of gender roles. The nuclear family, while still sought by many, became viewed as less something one naturally stepped into and stayed within, and more as a fragile unit, something that could come apart, be reconfigured, or give way to other forms of intimacy. But this more precarious nature of love and marriage and a greater uncertainty about gender roles required self-reflection and expression to discover who one wanted to be and how one wanted to relate intimately to others. Such reflection required peering into the private lives of others to figure out how others were building their own intimate lives. It also required revealing more of our own inner selves to gain help from others in our own building projects. Now, one manifestation of this need to figure out how we wish to shape our private lives has been the growth of psychology as both an academic field, an area of popular interest, a concern of many institutions, and here at Washington University as an undergraduate major. It has also been manifest in the great growth in many areas of popular culture, including film, theater, novels, and television, of plot lines that focus on the inner lives and intimate relationships of the characters they portray. To be sure, stories of romance have been an important part of American popular culture for a long time. What changed, however, in the 1960s was that these stories no longer necessarily followed standard plot lines where boy and girl had to overcome external odds to reach the mostly always happy ending. Rather, such stories of romance increasingly began having to compete with plots that involved characters paying attention to their own inner psychic lives to negotiate all sorts of intimate relationships. Hitchcock was a pioneer of this genre, but a more recent example is, and I have millions here to pick from, but one I particularly think is a very illuminating is Joan Didion's recent memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking. Now, I think this book contains a beautiful portrayal of what would have been viewed not that many decades ago as very private material. In short, I am claiming that greater choice and uncertainty about private life has led to a diminishment of the value of privacy, even in this realm, and to a greater sense that we are the individual negotiators of the degree we disclose our inner life and of the audience we disclose it to. Thus, over the last 50 years or so, coming out for gays and lesbians has become less a singular act, one made primarily to one's family, and more of a set of disclosures, one made to certain people rather than others. But both the shift in privacy to something less necessarily good and more individually negotiable laid the groundwork for us to individually stretch our own privacy boundaries when such networking sites as Facebook made that possible. Now, there is a third theme that I wish to explore in my book, and that is the relationship between privacy and discretion. A lot of the above discussion has focused on middle-class people, and that is not accidental, since privacy in the US has generally been understood as a right, as what one can expect to be honored by others, and generally poor and racialized people have had much less access to rights than others. Thus, in the first half of the 20th century, when the discipline of psychology began to expand into many American institutions, it did so not so much as a means to help middle-class people figure out how to construct their own lives, that came later, but more to help middle-class authorities best explain and manage what they saw as the problematic, intimate, and domestic lives of others. In other words, privacy historically has been less what poor and racialized people could claim as a right, and more what they had to learn to deploy to protect the safety of themselves and their loved ones. And now my colleague Jeffrey McCune has beautifully captured this distinction between privacy and what he labels as discretion in his work on Black men and the down low. So the last important theme that I will be considering in this book is how privacy has had different meanings for the poor and racialized from those more economically and racially privileged. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Joe and the Interdisciplinary Project for inviting us. And thanks to the law school for making me feel as if I'm finally a law student, which would have pleased my mother no end. So, okay. So I'm going to talk about surveillance and then float back to privacy, which is not an area of floating. But who could be more vocally and iconically opposed to state surveillance than the makers of modern literature? It's, of course, George Orwell, the 20th century political novelist. You've heard of him, I think? Yes? He may have been on screen earlier. It's, of course, George Orwell, the 20th century political novelist, whose dystopian narrative, 1984, still provides the official portrait of an ever-watchful thought police bent on abolishing intellectual privacy. A portrait whose family resemblance to the 21st century NSA, President Barack Obama, you've heard of him as well, was forced to deny at a recent press conference. And it's one of the more literary of 20th century social theorists, Michel Foucault, you've heard of him, whose study of the birth of the prison, discipline, and punish once provided the most persuasive fiction of a modern disciplinary society built upon, quote, an infinitely generalized, remember that language? An infinitely generalizable mechanism of surveillant panopticism, end quote. Foucault's brilliantly visceral prison of words, this is to say, did more to instill fear of a panoptic or all-seeing mode of power of mind over mind than any concrete penitentiary. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham's now famous blueprint for a panoptic prison, a ring of transparent cells surrounded by an opaque central guard tower, was in fact abandoned in his lifetime, and his explicit warning against perverse applications of his plan argued in advance against Foucault's inflationary coinage of general social panopticism. It is the same Foucault so gifted in writing up hyperbolic but hyper-real accounts of pervasive surveillance who also insisted on modern authorship's codependence on it. To his mind, the birth of the author as such was bound up with this figure's codification as an object of legal observation and penalty. Speeches and books were assigned real authors, Foucault contended in his influential essay, What is an Author, from 1969. Only when the author became subject to punishment and to the extent that his discourse was considered transgressive. In other, less responsible words, Foucault suggested that the pleasures of modern literary celebrity, the compensations of preening and drawing royalty payments as the godlike inventor of an original literary work, were inseparable from the pains of state scrutiny and state-imposed accountability for presumptively unorthodox opinion. In one significant sense, then, there might have been no baseline literary privacy, the creative privacy of individual authorship, without the enabling burden of literary surveillance. Which brings me to the first of three main points. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. Which brings me to the first of three main points I'd like to make in and out of my professional costume as an English professor. Namely, that it should be known more widely outside literature departments that recent scholarship on writing and surveillance tends to emphasize the energizing impact of the latter on the former. Whether or not they follow in Foucault's footsteps, and these footsteps have been growing fainter all the time, post-Foucaultian critics have often highlighted the ironic collaborations of nominally free literary authors and nominally repressive state readers. For example, and Joe Loewenstein can tell us about this to a greater extent than I can, but for example, scholars of the early modern English Renaissance, the cultural efflorescence responsible for Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and someone named William Shakespeare, have shown how the hermeneutics of surveillance and censorship helped to spark literary ingenuity, forcing playwrights and poets to master the indirect arts of allusion, innuendo, and allegory. Bad for privacy, good for literature. The astonishing verbal inventiveness of Shakespeare's day, the argument runs, owed a debt to the henchmen of the English monarchy who spied on, prosecuted, and in a few dramatic instances removed the hands or ears of offending writers. In my forthcoming book, FBI's, a study of J. Edgar Hoover's secret career as a fan and tormentor of African-American literature, I explore how the writers of a later cultural renaissance, the one centered in 1920s Harlem, made the best of their image in the FBI's spyglass. Intensive FBI investigation of black authors was not a good thing for African-American literature, full stop. But the literary record shows that knowledge of what I call bureau ghost reading fueled a split experience of vulnerability and enhanced cultural confidence among its writer targets. At last, bragged a representative literary editor of Marcus Garvey's journal, The Negro World, Washington, D.C. is taking our writing seriously. That's the upside of surveillance. To paraphrase the literary historian Annabelle Patterson, it's thus undoubtedly true that literary surveillance can be extremely, perhaps disastrously repressive, but equally true that a naive black and white version of the liberal position on this surveillance needs complicating in a wide range of historical cases. I will give you no more, so have no fear. Which brings me to my second main point. Despite my discipline's characteristic fondness for irony and complication, it's only literature scholars, after all, who deploy the verb to complicate as a term of honor. I think that the particular ongoing case of massive NSA telecommunications surveillance deserves a purposefully naive response of unmixed outrage. This is not our parents' patchwork surveillance, our hip sisters' worn copy of Discipline and Punish, our big brother's big brother. I couldn't resist that. This is a non-fictional program of the US government to place the spoken and written expression of entire populations under permanent watch, to collect and stockpile, as the editor of The Guardian newspaper phrases it, all the signals all the time, to capture every internet search and phone call, text, and email we make and send each other. I have no doubt that years down the road, this unhinged effort at electronic omniscience will be seen to have inspired valuable literary innovations. The encoded tweet may, notice the way I said it, the encoded, I'll say it more evenly, the encoded tweet may someday be remembered as the great poetic genre of our time. In the meantime, however, I propose that we listen more closely to the irony-free voice of Representative James Sensenbrenner, Republican of Wisconsin, who notes that, quote, the NSA is gathering on a daily basis the details of every call that every American makes, as well as every call made by foreigners to or from the United States, end quote. How can all these calls, he reasonably asks, be relevant to a specific investigation of terrorism? The fact that Sensenbrenner was the lead author of the USA Patriot Act of 2001, a secret policeman's wish list, and the specific legislation cited by the NSA to justify its phone tapping, lends his question a certain gravity. As best as I can tell, and for some reasons intelligence services don't always confess the full story of their capacities, but as best as I can tell, the NSA's bulk collection programs differ from earlier systems of US government surveillance in more than their prodigious supercomputing power. Technological determinism, then, should not be the only argument and excuse for their special excesses. Above all, these programs are distinguished by an unprecedentedly tight meshing of commercial and governmental interests. As my co-panelist Neil Richards has noted here and elsewhere, federal and corporate surveillance now support each other in a complex manner that is often impossible to disentangle. Yahoo may have announced just 2 days ago, I'm not exclaiming, it's the name of the company. Yahoo may have announced just 2 days ago that it will encrypt its users' online communications, the better to keep them safe from the prying eyes of state actors. But this move follows the forced admission that the NSA's PRISM spying program has been allowed direct access to the service of technology companies, including Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. It's a good thing none of us ever interacts with those, so we're safe. In 2011, it turns out, the NSA paid almost $400 million to the likes of Verizon and AT&T to ensure convenient secret wiretapping of their customers. Government surveillance has thus become a corporate revenue stream, as was said earlier, as well as a silent partner in gathering lucrative data on consumer preferences. The more we learn about the US security state's feeding of the great fortunes of the information age, the less that NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden's expatriation to the former Soviet Union looks like a case of accidental tourism. Which leads me to my final questions and final point. Why, despite his anti-corporatism, don't more US citizens consider Snowden a hero? Why hasn't his exposure of novel threats to the First and Fourth Amendments inspired the kind of sweeping congressional investigations of US intelligence that followed the Watergate scandal, at least thus far? There haven't been these things. Why, all relevant exceptions admitted, are the post-Snowden NSA's toughest critics an eccentric alliance of offshore investigative journalists, Obama-wary Tea Party conservatives, and ticked-off European heads of state? The most common answers to such question involve basic changes in the meaning and experience of privacy, the defining enemy of modern surveillance. Changes suggested in the design of this panel. American kids today, it is said, are too busy posting intimate selfies and indulging in other forms of electronic exhibitionism to value the zone of personal seclusion painstakingly constructed from Warren and Brandeis to Griswold v. Connecticut. According to none other than Mark Zuckerberg, I brought up his name in vain earlier, according to none other than Mark Zuckerberg, the empire builder of Facebook, the arrival of social networking has meant an increasing opening of the self to voyeuristic study. Privacy, he helpfully explained in 2010, is no longer the social norm it was among young people he encountered in his Harvard dormitory way back in 2003. Ancient times. The redefined norm is instead to attract and enjoy electronic surveillance, quote, by sharing more information of different kinds, more openly, and with more people. If Zuckerberg is right, and it pains me to admit he may be, at least in part, then it isn't difficult to see why the revelations of extreme NSA Facebooking, that's a term I've invented, NSA Facebooking, have failed to spark a youth movement dedicated to revitalizing the right to privacy. But I want to end by specifying that youthful indiscretions and changing perceptions of personal space aren't enough to explain our generally subdued reaction to the summer of Snowden, which began in June, if you're interested. Anytime our most adult and most public ideals of knowing uncritically embrace large-scale data mining, anytime, to take the example of my own discipline of literature, we assume that to digitize and to pattern recognize all text is to know all literature. We create little NSAs of the mind. Okay, that's exaggerated, but you get the point. Little NSAs of the mind, and we learn to live in them in tune with the machinery of contemporary mass surveillance. Our mode of knowing all is ironically congruent with the NSAs. Building effective opposition to this surveillance will thus involve not only a re-education in the value of personal privacy, but also a remaking of public canons of transpersonal knowledge. Thanks.
I'm not sure why I'm here. I'll start out with that. Somehow Joe cornered me and said, you should be on this panel. And I said, I don't do anything like this. And he said, you know that stuff you're doing with that Nazi woman and Nkrumah? That would be interesting for this. And I said, okay. Because I don't write about privacy and I don't write about surveillance, but I work with the evidence that surveilling states leave behind. So I thought that that might be my entree into this discussion. So what I'd like to do is to reflect a little bit, not on the past, but on historical futures, to think about the implications of increased surveillance of private worlds on the politics and ethics of writing histories of and in the future. And I believe that privacy discourse and surveillance have sort of grown up together, particularly in the last 50 years. So I want to come to that point via kind of winding path through archives in West Africa, the US, and Europe. I'm an historian of 20th century colonial and post-colonial Africa, and I've spent a lot of time in archives, state archives. And many of you will know that those colonial states recognized few rights, least of all the right to privacy in terms of their subject populations. And of course, many of us have read about the panoptic aspirations, a la Foucault, we just heard about, of those states, and their desire to see everything but not always be seen, but also the very limits of those panoptic visions, a la Anne Laura Stoller. Now, as a historian, I was taught to read everything critically, the historical evidence that states leave behind, including this state we live in. So I'm aware of their biases and limitations. But to be honest, it's only been recently that I've become more aware about the importance of thinking critically about the politics, about the ethics of utilizing archival evidence I've uncovered in official state archives. And that's become particularly more pressing, to me anyway, as this NSA scandal has unfolded. Now, when most historians like me reflect back on their archival experiences, it's often with this sort of sense of wonder at the labors of research, and we wax rapturous about the capacity of archival discoveries to bring us in contact with the past. So it's about sort of digging in and finding some gem of evidence that brings the past to light. And when we're not able to do that in the archives, then we create our own archives through interviews and archaeological evidence, what have you. But when it comes to official state archives, I have generally approached them, as have my colleagues, with the knowledge that they are biased and incomplete, and therefore any hidden gems that we find are a result of my own amazing, careful reading of that archive against the grain, or perhaps some archivist who had a hangover or something, wasn't doing their job, and left some kind of really juicy piece of evidence in the archive. Now, most of you know that most of these state archives have a 30 or 50-year rule, so things have to be at least 30 years old before they come into the public domain, sometimes 50. And then, of course, sometimes, like the British colonial state, when it comes to Kenya and Mau Mau, just hide them somewhere for a long time until somebody actually digs them out. So anything I found in those archives were just sort of mine. And then there was a great case, many of you know Anthony Appiah, the philosopher. Well, his mother was British and his father was Ghanaian, and the mother moved to Britain in 1952 and was having Anthony, Kwame, and the British were like spying on her. And so there's this whole file in the National Archives in Britain about the fact that he is 2 years old and she's still breastfeeding him. Incredible. Now, at that point, this was years ago, I just photocopied it and gave it to her because I happened to know her, and she kind of got a kick out of it. Now, about 6 years ago, I started working on a project about Kwame Nkrumah's years in power and the sort of intimate connections he had with a number of women, because I'm interested in the ways in which intimacy works at the center of state power. And what I found in the context of that research is that the post-colonial archive, the one post-independence, isn't exactly the direct descendant of the colonial archive. For a lot of African states, the archiving process kind of ground to a halt at a certain point in time. They're less interested in the panopticon capabilities of the state and of archives. And so I kept coming up with fragments of evidence that shouldn't have been there to begin with. So for example, in the state archive, I would find like an odd personal letter. Now, Nkrumah was overthrown in a coup in 1966. And so some military guy had sort of ruffled through his papers, and somehow, you know, kind of love letters ended up and they should have been destroyed. They would have been destroyed by statute or put under a 50-year rule or something, but they're just sitting there. So I call that a sort of accidental archive. It's an accidental state archive. And on the other hand, you have the emergence of these huge surveillance states during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union leading the way, who are amassing incredible amounts of material about other parts of the world, especially during the Cold War. And so those I found full of all kinds of material too, and I'm calling those kind of a shadow archive. They shadow the sort of nation-state archive in Ghana, which has not been very interested in archiving. So given the fact that for me, the colonial archive had always been, it was just like this panopticon, an inept one. But I would go in and dig for gems, and I saw it as something that was just tried to reproduce its own state power through archiving, and whatever I could get out of it was fair game. But then in my search for Nkrumah and these sort of intimate connections, I came across an amazing set of papers at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. Nkrumah, the last person to fly a plane out of Berlin was a woman named Hanno Reitsch. And she was eventually shot down by the Soviets, and she spent a lot of time being re-educated. She ended up in Ghana in the 1960s running a gliding school. So I'm fascinated by her, and she had a very close relationship with Nkrumah. So I go to read her papers at the Deutsches Museum, which is an official museum. And there's all this well, mostly there's nothing damning about her at all. They're so sanitized, they're squeaky clean. But then there are letters that another woman wrote to her, who I'm also writing about, and they're lengthy letters about her love for Nkrumah, about how she's suffering from depression, and all this stuff is put, and at the bottom of the letter she writes, "Please, Hannah, destroy this after you read it." Now, clearly she didn't. I'm sitting in Munich reading it. What do I do with that? So my first reaction was, wow, this is excellent, right? A little bit of evidence. But it started to bother me. So in this particular context, because it's in a public archive, is it public? Even though it was private, it was always meant to be private. Am I, as a scholar, required to respect her request at the bottom of that letter? So it's from that space that I began questioning and engaging with what I think this panel has been getting us toward, which is the public and the private surveillance and that slide toward the public as things move from the private to the public. When the story first broke about the NSA, I mean, people's first response was, well, it's everybody's cell phone, so it doesn't really matter. So it's just like a bunch of random material, doesn't matter. And it's the same way that people reacted to those, these things, those body scanners thing. Well, they're okay as long as they don't actually like really see you like you're naked. And there's like, well, maybe you do sort of look naked, so maybe they are a problem. I'm troubled by the ways in which these kinds of arguments get deployed. In what ways are we not only accepting this level of surveillance, but actually actively participating in it? And this was raised earlier. There's a guy who wrote this blog, and he talks about the participatory panopticon, the ways in which we ourselves have constructed this panopticon of Bentham fame, and the ways in which the NSA has been able to do what it does, and this has been raised earlier, because of the ways in which we have participated. And what is the evidence generated by such an exercise as state surveillance? And then what will scholars do with that evidence? As we are beginning to understand, it's massive, it's personal, it's global, and it's in real time. It is not as it was 50 years ago, which is not very long ago, and centuries before, pieces of paper that had to be cataloged, vetted, listed, filed. It's digital, and it can be, it's a behemoth. It's measured in, I didn't even know these things existed, yettabytes and zottabytes, which are millions and millions of gigabytes. It's evidence, it's historical evidence that can be searched with tremendous agility and astounding precision. But if everything is recorded in real time, and literally every action of every person all the time, we can now actually do that. We can store it. What is a historian supposed to be doing 20 or 30 years from now? How will we construct the past? What is our role? What's the role of is like a film editor? That's historian as film editor. Does it matter if those whose very private lives are captured in that data, in that evidence, did not give their consent? Perhaps nation states will not even be the primary surveillors of our private lives, and I think we've heard good evidence today that they're not. That in fact, the line between the state and transnational corporations now is as blurry as it's ever been. As Google executives, sort of the line just gets murkier and murkier. And what will the ethics, the politics of history writing be, especially if the line between private and public has lost all meaning? Will history by then have lost any ability to explain? Those are a lot of questions. I don't actually have answer to any of them. But I think that it's worth thinking about. By that time, 20 or 30 years from now, when that evidence is available to write about right now, if I'm still around, I can assure you I will not be writing history books. I might be writing poetry. I think that's far better suited of making sense of today's closely surveilled nadir. Thanks.